We can all talk about like recreational stuff later. But for now,
recreational stuff.
Live stream has started, so we're recording and streaming. So yeah, we're going to start our third unit for our 1301 dual credit U.S. history course. And notes for this, they're going to come in three parts. This is the first part. I saved it as a PDF and posted it on our Google Classroom. And so during this period, we're going to discuss. We're going to just kind of breeze over the Constitution because you're going to get a lot of like more details into the U.S. Constitution next year, the U.S. government. But we are going to talk about some of the events. So we're going to go first off with George Washington, as we have it. And there's the Betsy Ross flag, which was kind of a hot potato issue like a year ago for no reason.
What was?
The Betsy Ross flag. Some people said it was offensive.
How is it offensive?
I don't know. I never got it. But whatever. I don't get a lot of things. So yeah, the name of this unit's the Early Republic.
It's true, and therefore it's offensive to my modern culture.
So you don't have to write this down, but this is things we will cover. The transitions on this are going to be really, really off because it was a PowerPoint that got converted. So George Washington's presidency, the formation of political parties, which were, of course, the Democrat Republicans, which will eventually become the Democrat Party, and the Federalists, which will kind of become the Whigs, and then the Republicans later on. We have the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, totally going to change the face and shape of America. Jeffersonian democracy, which is going to lead to a lot of the ideas that we hold of like American values today, but it's also going to come like a catch-22 that is going to probably harden the ideology of the South later. The War of 1812, the era of good feelings, and the Monroe Doctrine. So, and of course, we're also going to talk a little bit about like religious and social movements and things like that going on during the time as well. So moving right along. You didn't have to write that down. All right. Yeah, this I need to go in and change the transitions on this. So to start off with, President number one. Remember, a lot of our focus, I'm not really a social historian kind of guy. I kind of do like dead people and wars, the nuts and bolts. But I am very interested in ideology. So back to dead people. George Washington is president. Our first president from April 30th, 1789 to March the 4th, 1797. So don't worry, you don't have to worry so much about the calendar days, but yours don't hurt. Yours certainly don't hurt. If I think a day is very important, I will tell you.
Okay, I trust you.
Okay,
I don't.
Yes, today?
Today's the 24th.
Yeah, today's the 24th.
Is it important though?
Yes. It's the day
We're here, aren't we? All right, so this is going to set precedents for all other presidents following after him. So what we mean by that is he's going to serve 2 terms. And so that's going to be a pretty big tradition for a while, up until FDR. He's also going to establish a cabinet of advisors. And so cabinet positions are still around today. We usually call them secretaries. Though sometimes I think they're also called czars, which is kind of like a new phenomenon. You'll have like a drug czar, and I think they're talking about making a COVID czar, which is somebody who essentially the president gives executive authority over an issue to try to solve. So
That's weird. That should not exist.
yeah, I don't know why we would choose a
Czar.
Russian Caesar
Yeah.
word. So, but
That's a little scary to me. I'm gonna be
there's
honest.
some things. All right, so the Constitution, of course, talks about the office of the presidency, but it's very vague as far as like any other like positions with the president. But it's an accepted thing because people understand that being the chief diplomat and enforcer of the law, even over of a nation as small as it was back then, people realized one president couldn't do it alone. So you have to have advisors. Declared neutrality when the British and French went to war with each other following our American Revolution. So once again, we're going to see when we look at his farewell address later on in the unit, we'll see that he wanted us to stay away from what he called entangling alliances, like the type of alliances that empires often got into.
So the kind of that we're in.
Well, the kind that definitely helped make a bigger mess in World War I, for example. But I mean, yeah, we have a lot of entangling alliances now thanks to the Cold War. NATO and the United Nations and things like that, which have been very good for the past 70 or so years, except for maybe, like a couple of hiccups. But if there ever becomes a great superpower that is against our alliances, that could be scary again. Because then, everybody could get involved in something that you didn't start. He believed the U.S. must remain neutral in order to survive. Small nation, not a powerful army, navy, or economy. He didn't see any point. He saw a lot of destruction going on in Europe. And in this time, there was a lot of destruction going on in Europe. The normal thing in Europe is warfare. They're almost always fighting each other. Following World War II, Europe has had a very nice reprieve from warring with one another, either for empire or just amongst one another on the continent. So he wanted to stay out of that. He didn't want an American empire. Didn't want us to be within like ententes, leagues,
That's unfortunate.
stuff like that. Well, is that you could be cynical and say that couldn't last forever, or you could say he had it right. So I don't really know, honestly. I would prefer that America goes through periods of isolationism, and it feels very comfortable not to get in other people's business and not have them get in your business. But sometimes things get really, really bad, like the Holocaust and stuff like that, and people really want to do something about the world's problems. And sometimes if you don't do something about the world's problems, they get worse. Like they shut down your shipping lanes and stuff. Hey, so here's some points. New states that will join the Union during Washington's presidency. And so the Constitution talks about how vaguely how new states are formed, but it doesn't really talk too much about the expansion of U.S. territory. That's something that's going to have to be hammered out, as we'll see later on during the presidency of Jefferson. But these states must have a certain population, and when we talk about the Northwest Ordinance later, we'll see more details into that. They must ratify their own state constitution that must follow the U.S. Constitution. They have to have fair elections for the representative government, and then Congress has to approve them becoming a state. And we'll see it happens for North Carolina in 1789, Rhode Island in 1790, Vermont 1791, Kentucky 1792, and Tennessee in 1796. So that was a big thing for the colonists before the American Revolution. People wanted to go out west. There were still people coming to America, immigrating in from Europe and the British Isles. And of course, you also had the natural increase of families. People were having babies, and then they grow up and they want their own farm. Because that was just the standard way that people raised families, lived out their lives, and made cash back then. Largely self-sufficient, but in the South, you could, we're going to talk about the growth of the plantation economy as well. Of course, these lands weren't empty. We will talk about the troubles that Native Americans had with colonists and vice versa. It's nothing new.
It's everything new, Mr. Wade.
It's all perception.
It's new in your eyes. It's new.
Ugly transitions. All right. Oops. Okay. So during this time period, we're also going to have the formation of first political parties. This is something else that Washington warned against, but not just Washington. This goes back to the idea of factions. And so in the Federalist Papers, Madison would warn against factions. A faction is essentially a party. It could be a political party, but it could also be like different interests. Like factions could be something that separates people based on their economics, based on their religion, based on their race, based on where they live, based on what they do for a living. Any way that you can categorize people
They have
can make people have conflict, because often people team up and they go against whoever's not in their team. It's one of the scary aspects of democracy, and of course nationalism as well. So unfortunately for Washington, as soon as he leaves the presidency, these parties will form immediately. George Washington was not affiliated with a political party, and as I said, warned against them. The first, however, that's going to come up under the leadership of Jefferson and Madison, ironically, is going to be the Democratic Republicans. And it's weird. Some history books will call them Democrats. Some will call them Republicans. But often in their own publication at the time, they used both words together. Even though it's a mouthful.
Republican, Republic Democratic.
It's just, it's a mouthful. So they believed in limited national government. So they fully supported the idea of what we would call state rights and state autonomy, which it reflected strict constructionist view of the Constitution. So a constructionist is this. A constructionist view of the Constitution is legal theory that you have to follow the Constitution verbatim. If it doesn't say that the government can do this, it may not do it. And if it says it must do this, then it has no choice. But it can't move in and out of those lines. Otherwise, it risks becoming a tyranny. So they were like, you can't just read the law and say, well, they meant to do this and then do it. They were like, no, can't do that. Opposed national bank and tariffs. So a national bank was the brainchild of someone we'll talk about a bit more, Alexander Hamilton. He really, really, really wanted the U.S. economy to reflect that of industrial England, because England was the richest modern economy on the earth at this time. There was more cash flowing, material goods, and trade throughout the world. But he knew you need to have a highly regulated currency, inflation rates, and interest rates, and things like that. They also, as you see here, Democrat Republicans didn't trust that. They believed that the banks usually did things like make high interest loans against farmers, manipulate currency against those who don't have a lot of money, and foreclose on people's farms. They thought that the banks could just kind of screw over the farmers. They also opposed tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. Farmers don't make a lot of cash. So they believed the fairest thing to do was let farmers in the open market buy whatever they wanted as cheap as possible, even if it wasn't made in America. They were like, let the free market decide. They also thought it would be great to have an agricultural-based economy. Not necessarily the plantation-based, as according to Jefferson and Madison, though. They both had plantations. But their idea was essentially kind of like this nostalgic view of a Roman citizen during the early Roman Republic, where, or even ancient Greece, where you farmed your own land, but when you had in time of need, where your country needed you to volunteer for government or military service, you did so.
Do they not remember how both of those ended?
They did, but they believed that the checks and balance system of the Constitution could help mitigate that.
Yes, very smart.
But so they thought we could kind of be like not the golden age, but more like the free age of say the Roman Republic.
The golden age was very unfree.
Well, it was if you had the money. All right.
Costs.
Well, that's how it goes for a lot of things. I mean, you want to you're charged with a crime, got to have money. You want to own things that other people don't have access to, money. It's kind of, I don't want to be cynical. There's that word again, but I mean, it's kind of just how things work. Our first political parties, the second one, of course, was the Federalist, which is signified by the leadership of Alexander Hamilton. And it's just kind of funny because Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton will all be part of President Washington's cabinet. And they will disagree with one another on policy, but they all respected Washington enough to do what he wanted. So, of course, they will have a falling out later. Don't worry about that. So, Federalist, strong national government, a centralized government. So, Hamilton was a centrist, is what you want to call that. He believed that if we wanted to have a nation that was going to be truly successful, it all has to be on the same page. It can't just be this chaos where people are off doing their own thing for selfish reasons when you could actually be one of the greatest nations on earth. A loose constructionist view of the Constitution.
That's what I have.
So he believed that you didn't have to look at what was implicitly said in the Constitution, that life's too complicated, that there are certain issues that you're just going to have to trust your judgment on, and that the central government needed this leeway in order to do it. Favored national bank and tariffs. So he, of course, wanted a national bank to help out with financing, commerce, and helping out with business loans so that we could have entrepreneurs have that starting capital in order to make America more of a modern economy. He supported tariffs because a tax on foreign goods meant that the things made at home could sell better. So that way you could get rid of competition. Once again, basing it off of the English model. He thought that manufacturing and shipping would be a very big part of our economy. Later on, you're going to have, they're going to try to stitch these two economic ideas together called the American model later, or the American system. It's not going to really come into play, but the idea was like mixing agriculture and manufacturing together to make all America, like all made in America type stuff, right? Like we grow the things needed, and then they go to the factories to be made and sold overseas. But it's not going to become very systematically organized like I thought. Because eventually we're going to have the secession crisis and civil war and all that other stuff. All right, so poor George Washington. So there's going to be a whole lot of problems when the nations first formed together. Problems like states are in debt. And when states are in debt, we're going to see that some of these states paid off their national debts, their state or their colonial debts from the American Revolution, and some didn't. And the ones who were fiscally responsible didn't want to have to pay for the ones who weren't. Another thing is, too, a lot of the soldiers from the American Revolution were never paid. What are you going to do about that? And another is that the American Revolution gave a lot of people a fervent kind of patriotism for individualism and anti-taxation. Remember, no taxation without representation? Well, a lot of those veterans of the American Revolution find it disgusting that they fought a war against taxation. They didn't really care so much about the higher ideas, but when it comes to your wallet, you might be willing to throw down. But when the federal government starts asking for taxes, it's not going to come out so well. So leads us to the Whiskey Rebellion.
That system didn't work as well as it did in England, because the English were used to taxes and kind of understood why they had them at least a little bit. But, you know, all the colonials had with the idea of taxes was, you know, the people who don't understand us take our money.
Well, that's true to point. I mean, the colonials were used to paying taxes. They would even pay taxes to pay for their state churches and stuff like that within the colonies. But it was a tax to locals that they had a say-so in, you know, like that point you made. So
Not just like government tax to people who they don't know,
yeah. And that's the thing. I mean, they
who don't care about them.
they controlled what they could buy as well, and they really hated that. But back to this. So farmers in western Pennsylvania staged a rebellion against the government tax on whiskey and the grain it was made from. And see, that's the thing. There's a lot more of a profit margin for a lot of these farmers. A lot of these farmers who were interested in international shipping could make more money if they made their grain into liquor, because they could take their grain and by making it into something like whiskey with their corn, that corn could sell more as whiskey than it could as corn going overseas. And another thing is corn grew well here in the States, but the European diet didn't really care much for corn. They kind of called it, they considered it like animal feed, you know, like they didn't have a taste for it. Yeah. But whiskey, on the other hand, Europeans and the British sure love themselves some hard drink. However, the government decided to have a tax on whiskey because they had to stay solvent, for one. There was a lot of things that had to be paid for in the newly formed nation. Popular rebellion came up, and it was very stylized like what happened right before the American Revolution. Protest in front of government officials, tarring and feathering, armed revolt, all that stuff. However, Washington will personally lead federal troops into Pennsylvania and put down this rebellion. It's going to be the only time that a sitting U.S. president will lead troops into battle. And so one of his first actions we see here is to put down Americans who were trying to essentially overthrow the newly formed government. The rebels fled, and the leaders were arrested, and I believe they were hung. The tax was imposed in January 1791, and the rebellion occurred in 1794. Jefferson will repeal it because he loves himself some farmers, but get more to that later. So there we have it. First one. And kind of a wake-up call. It let a lot of them know that the newly formed American government meant serious business, and that the idea of armed rebellion against that government wasn't going to stand. And it says specifically in the Constitution that rebellions can be put down. So, all right, next one. So another thing we're going to do during this time period is build our military up. So following the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army and the Continental Marines were disbanded after signing the Treaty of Paris. A lot of those soldiers and Marines who fought in the American Revolution had really wanted to go home for a while. A lot of them, they had to be very carefully coaxed into re-enlisting during the war because they watched so many of their fellow soldiers die of, disease and cold and hunger and stuff like that. So it wasn't exactly like a very glamorous thing to be in. So they were definitely really ready to go home when the war was over. However, Congress of the Confederation, this is during the Articles of Confederation, before the Constitution, will establish the U.S. Army in 1784. Moving on from there, threats to U.S. shipping by Barbary coast pirates prompted Congress to create the U.S. Navy in 1794, followed by the Marines in 1789. So, Barbary pirates, these were essentially pirates who were tied, if I remember correctly, to the Ottoman Turks. And see, I think they're all from Morocco or Tunisia, I forgot. And so American shipping interest would, of course, sail into the Mediterranean for the sake of commerce and trade. But one thing is that British vessels were left largely unharmed by these pirates. And because the British government paid essentially not ransom, but they paid a fee to use the ocean, so the
It
pirates
sounds
went.
like the mafia to me.
Well, yeah, it's as old as anything, right? It's as old as money. Pay up, and we'll leave your people alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we refused to do that, and so that led to some of our ships being attacked, and we're going to get to more of that later. But yeah, of course, the Mediterranean wasn't quite as controlled by the Muslims as it used to be. Back in the Battle of Lepanto, I think in the 1490s, the Spanish completely wiped out their the Ottoman Armada, and from then on, the sea was mostly under European control over there. Though, of course, like you see here, there were problems with pirates, and it was pretty bad because if you got captured and if you couldn't pay ransom, you were literally made into a slave. And so the rest of your life, you were working as a slave until you died of it. So, because according to their belief, provided you weren't Muslim, you were fair game to be a slave. And if you couldn't pay a ransom, then you're better off.
What if you became a Muslim as a slave?
That did happen sometimes, and you were free.
What?
Yeah.
Big brain.
Yeah.
That is massive brain. If I ever become a Muslim slave, I'll be like, I'll pretend to be a Muslim.
But I'm going to tell you a modern story, though. I remember reading a story about tourists in the Philippines, and these tourists were actually at a resort, and they were captured by the Moros. The Moros are a radical Muslim Filipino terrorist group in some of the western islands in the Philippines. And this couple was captured, and they knew that they were Americans and those were Europeans. And they told them, you must convert right now. And so several of the people did. And the ones who did were beheaded right then, right after they did it. But they didn't behead them because they were waiting for them to do it. So it was like the craziest thing. So eventually the police found out where they were at and freed them. But it was like, so be careful with that. So then,
Maybe I won't.
yeah, so it might not work out. It might not work out. And there's also there's stories sometimes.
I would only pretend. I'd be like, yo,
Then they would pretend to cut your head off.
don't pretend to cut my head. Exactly. That's
Okay.
what I mean.
It's all make believe. All right, let's go on to the next one. So, appointing a presidential cabinet. So, good old Georgie's doing all kinds of things. So, the Constitution makes no mention of the cabinet, but it does state the president may require opinions of heads of executive departments.
Exactly.
So, yes, they're beheaded heads.
Yeah.
Washington's cabinet set the president for future presidents. Once again, so his cabinet was made up of Henry Knox, Secretary of War, Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State. So that's the lead diplomat. We don't have a Secretary of War anymore. Now we call it Secretary of Defense. Edmund Randolph is the Attorney General, so he's the lead, prosecutor and lawyer for federal government. And Alexander Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury. So you see military, diplomacy, law enforcement, monies. So we'll do one more after this, and I think we'll be good. And then I'm going to go back here. I'm going to start reading the little essays because I owe y'all some grades in those tests.
Nah, you don't owe me any grades. Unless they're A's, then you owe me grades.
It's their A's. I owe you what you deserve, sir.
And I deserve all F's. Every single one.
For fantastic.
And for the absolute freaking failure.
Let's go to the next one. Boop. Okay. Boop. Waiting. Okay, let's go. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to test you over who his cabinet members were. Just know, though, that what a cabinet is, and that's a group of, it's advisors, but at the same time, they got a lot of power. At the president's behest, they can do a lot of things. The Secretary of State can do a lot of structuring and enforcing the military. The Secretary of Treasury can do a lot of things regarding coinage and tax
We can make
enforcement.
pennies useless.
The what?
We can make pennies useless.
Make pennies useless. Well, I think they cost more to make and ship than they're worth. When I was stationed in Italy, we didn't have pennies on base. We used American currency, but yeah, there was no pennies because we just always rounded. I think it just cost too much to put them on a boat and bring them over.
They need to make a 30-cent piece.
30-cent piece.
So we don't need to write the last bullet point there?
You don't have to. I don't know. The thing is, I got a feeling one day it's all going to be government controlled crypto. There's so many things that are
They
moving.
want it to be.
Yeah, I think it's going to be.
That would be nice.
Who knows? Maybe one day it might be
It would have a more
international.
regulated economy than the one that we have now, because cryptocurrency is actually limited to a point where once you get far enough, you can't get more efficiently at
Oh,
all.
yeah.
Because the blockchain increases at such a the difficulty of the blockchain increases at
They
such
need
a high
to
rate.
freeze money so easily.
Yeah, I was reading about a guy who, like 5 years ago, he could churn out 5 Bitcoins a month out of his servers in his basement, but now he can churn out half of one every 2 months. So it's like it takes a
Yeah.
lot of juice to.
It's all online.
Well, it's all online, but it's not regulated, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's a non-regulated form of currency, which means unlike the American dollar, it changes more, but it also is almost more regulated at a point, because U.S. currency can be changed and seized by the government.
It's
But-
fiat, yeah.
Bitcoin isn't owned by one person.
Well, that's the thing. That's my fear about crypto is that it's probably going to get hit by some regulation hammers pretty hard. The UN's been talking about it for a while. And there's actually banking conglomerates who are talking about making their own. And kind of fear is that if you have well-established monetary things like that, start making it, that people will probably stop recognizing the private cryptos.
Yeah.
But that's like looking into the future. I don't know. I'd be more worried about multinational crypto, because then that would really hurt the U.S. economy. One of the things that helps us out the most is that the dollar is the standard for the whole world, and that alone boosts our economy without even having to make anything. But if that stopped happening, oh gosh, that'd be rough. It'd be rough. All right.
I'll just move to Canada. It's cool.
Yeah, Canadian dollars. There you go. Well, all right. Speaking of economy, last one for the day, creating an economic system. The United States and individual states had a substantial debt from fighting the Revolutionary War, as I mentioned earlier. Hamilton. Yeah, not that guy over there. President Washington's Secretary of Treasury proposed that the national government assume the Revolutionary War debts of the state governments. He's like, look, this is what governments do. If we were the crown would accept it. So the central government, the federal government should accept these because, well, it was a war fought for that. To foster trade relations with other nations, a legitimate currency was needed too. We couldn't have 13 different kinds of dollars, one for each colony anymore. Hamilton's solution to create a national bank was eventually implemented. And that's going to be a big hot potato issue for American politics for a while. Eventually, we're going to see that it's going to be killed and resurrected. So the national bank is going to be one of those things where a lot of everyday farmers are going to despise. Where people with business interest, on the other hand, are like, well, let's keep this together. So that's going to end it for today. I'm going to go ahead and start grading those tests. And I'll talk to y'all later. Yeah, we're not going to have another class until Monday.